So what we're taking a look at today is adding some uniqueness to our website. For this to work, we're going to verify that the username is unique in the database, and we're also going to verify that an email address supplied is also unique in the database, which means we may need to add one or two elements to our form. At least we need to add an email element to our form, and quite possibly we may need to add a second password field, and this is optional. I'm a little old school. I prefer to have two password fields when I'm doing this kind of work. You, of course, can do what works for you, but this is what I do. This is what works for me. And you know what? We're actually going to take a look at this now. Before we do anything else, if we're going to capture an email address, we should probably add an extra email field to our database. So if you have your environment set up properly, where you've got your Debian server running, you should also have a secure copy connection open to it and a database connection open to it as well. In the database management software, typically SQL Manager for MySQL, you want to add a new field. I'm just simply going to call this field email. It is obviously of type text or varchar. You can make it a text. It doesn't really matter the size. You can make it a varchar and give it, let's say, 200 characters. I can't remember off the top of my head what the specification is for an email address. There is a specification, and I believe that specification has a maximum size. Varchar is fine. In MySQL, text is fine. You do you. The location of the field in the list of columns doesn't really matter. So we're going to create that, click on OK, and then execute that code. And now we have an email field in our table for our database. Any questions? All right. Now that we have our database done, we could close this, but we're not going to. We're going to validate our work going forward. Okay? So I'm going to reposition my columns so I can see my data a little bit better, because I'm going to want to make sure that things are created properly for the next account that I create. All right, I'm going to create another test account. I'm going to make sure that it populates the email field properly. So I'm going to leave my MySQL software management software open. Alrighty. As I said, most of the work that we're going to do is going to be on the registration page. So double click on that to open it up in your preferred text editor. And I have everything in one page. And in this case, it's going to help, because at some point, you're going to want to redisplay this registration form back to the users with the information that they already supplied. If I tried registering and I registered incorrectly, I will want to see my username and I will want to see the email in that form again. And that's what I'm going to want to see from you for this competency. So because we're going to need to recreate this information inside of this form, it actually makes sense to have it all in one script. That's the way I would solve this problem. Okay? Because there's going to be a bunch of processing that occurs before we even display the form, what I think is that we should move this code where we display the form, we should move it after all that processing occurs. And that's what I'm going to do down here. Let's actually stick it right there. Of course, you need to understand your environment, and of course, you do you. Okay? So, we're going to need to come back and adjust that variable, but I'm going to check. Perfect. There's it there. What the hell am I looking for? That's better. Syntactical highlighting is always going to be your friend. Okay? So, if there isn't a password, make sure you display the form. We're also going to do an error array, and we're going to count the elements in an array as well. And if the error is greater than 0, we're also going to need to display that information. Okay? So obviously I have some problems up here. I'm going to need to start my PHP again. If I can actually type. Is that? I don't think I need that. But I'm going to leave that in place for right now. I don't need the else. So I don't need those brackets. So I'm going to remove those as well. Okay. And I'll add the components as I need going forward. Alrighty? So a lot of hopping around, I'm sorry, but this is my setup. You need to understand your code, and frankly, it's going to help you when it comes time to do this assignment. Somebody just started a recording, that's fine, but just please keep in mind that I'm also recording today's thing for my own desktop, but if you can record this as well, that's always acceptable with me. Okay? So, where are we? So we've done the we have created the extra field in our database. I'm also going to need to add some form elements as well. So I might as well do those right now as well. And of course, you can copy and paste these elements. So there's input elements for email. There's also an input element for password too, but I've already got that in mind, so I don't need to include that in this one. But I do need to add, there's my password too, so I do need to, at the point of the email, add an email element to my form. And of course, my text editor has, sorry, I'm drawing a blank. My text editor has an auto format feature in it, which I kind of like to use from time to time as a bit of a sanity check. Okay, so my elements are called my, and my username, but not my email. So this is actually, I didn't do this on purpose, but this kind of happens. When you take a look at the code, it doesn't use my username, my password, my password. So you're going to have to understand the variable names in your environment. If it starts throwing errors because the variables don't match, just understand that if you're copying and pasting my code, your form element names might not match my form element names. And right now, they don't even match. So I'm going to have to keep that in mind as well. I should, however, come up with a naming convention and stick to it. So that's what we're going to do. Alrighty? Any questions? All right. So I'm calling everything my, just because that's what I'm doing. Yeah. My username and password. Perfect. So when I take a look at this, I need to do a my email as well and my password too as well. So let's add those elements to my form. Well, perfect. I should probably do it like that because that's the order they are in the form. You always got to feng shui your code, don't you? All right. So that's what that is. I've added the variables so that I can use them. It's going to throw some warnings later on, but we can address those as we go through. I also need to set an array, a list of array elements. Because as we're going through, anytime there's a problem with any aspect or any data element in this registration process, we're going to push that error into the array. I kind of made reference to this. You haven't had that class yet, never mind. There's a couple of different ways. You can just fail the whole process on a single error and say that's it, done, this isn't working properly, and that's kind of what we do with the brute forcing in our next class. But this case, you don't want to, if the users make a mistake in registration, you may want to give them as much information to fix all of those mistakes that they've made. If they've made one, this doesn't matter, but if they've made multiple errors, you want to return multiple errors to the user so they can fix them all at once. To that end, we're creating an array of errors, which we will then display the errors later on, right about here. If there's any errors in my error array, then I'm going to push out those errors one after another. To that end, we need to create an array of errors. You can do it right here before you get into starting to actually processing the information, because we're going to have to at some point process that information as well, but we need to do some error checking before we start that. Okay, so there's my errors, my array of errors. Any questions? Okay, now if there's any problems with any of these, you want to add to the list of array mistakes. If, for example, the username is empty, say the username is required. If the email is empty, say the email is required. If the password is empty, say password is required. If the email is invalid, say, hey, there's something wrong with the email. And there's this filter variable using the filter validate email. It's not a template, but let's call it a template. I'm drawing a blank on what that is. Mask. If there's a mask that defines what an acceptable email is for the filter var function, we can push that error to our array of errors as well. So that's what we're going to do. After we have created our array, we're going to add this. And we're also going to validate that the email address is the correct format. Perfect. And because they're just simple one-line if-then clauses, I'm not going to create multiple lines for those. Any questions? Alrighty. So we've done a lot of that. Now we want to verify if the passwords don't match. Okay. I can do that there as well. Sure, that works. So quickly, if they haven't supplied an email, we warn them. If they haven't supplied a username, we warn them. If the password is empty, the first password field, we warn them. If the passwords don't match, we warn them. And if their email is an invalid format, we warn them with error messages. Okay? Now, the smart of you in the group, which is all of you, of course, are going to push back and say, well, can't we just add required fields to those elements in the form? Yes, and we will be doing that because we're trying to make this as robust as possible. But as you've clearly seen, you never trust anything from the browser. Because users can circumvent our systems and because hackers can circumvent the form elements with simple DOM manipulation, we're not going to trust any data from the browser. We, as I've said time and time again, validate everything on the server side, and that's what we're doing here. Any questions? Does that make sense? Let's move on. Okay, so now that we have that in place, we can start checking to make sure that the elements in our database aren't, I'm sorry, the elements that we are in our form are not already in our database. And that's what, and I'm on slide 12, we're at the halfway point, that's a good time. Okay, so that's what we're doing on slide 12 now. We're verifying that the elements don't exist already in our database. And I apologize for this really crappy slide, but it's kind of necessary, and it carries on a little bit onto the next one as well. So slide 12 and 13 kind of need to go together, okay? So what we want to do is we want to select the code from slide 12 and slide 13 and add it to our site, or to our PHP code. All right, so now that we've checked some basic checks on the form data, what we're going to do now is we're going to try and select username and email information from our members table where the username matches the username or the email matches the email. And we're doing a limit 1. So the one flaw in all of this, and you can try and figure this out in the future, the one flaw in this is that it's limiting to a single response. So if their username, you fix the username problem, then it could come back with an email problem later on. That's just kind of how I did it. You do you, of course. What was I going to say? So we're selecting, and then we execute that statement here. If there is a username and it matches, push, the username already exists. If their email also matches, email already exists. All those get added to our array of errors. That was right here. Okay, pretty simple stuff at that point. Now we're just validating that the supplied information doesn't already exist in the database. If the user supplies two different things, then they're going to probably have to iterate through this if they're across two different records. All right. Should probably check email first and then check the user second, but I'll leave you to sort that out on your own. That's a little too granular for what I want to cover today. Okay. Now that we've done all of our checking to ensure that the uniqueness exists in our form, now we can consider writing the information to the database, which is what the next block is, the old block of our process register code, if you will. Create a salt your password, salt and hash your password, and then start writing it to the database. But we don't want to do this automatically. We only want to do this if there are no errors. So if there are no errors, or if the count of errors is equal to 0, process the statement, okay? And then you need to add an end curly brace before the else, all right? Else, for each of the errors, print the error, which is going to go after our statement saying you have registered. What? I didn't hit copy. Much better. All right. So let's re-indent our data again. So if their errors is equal to 0, process the entity in the database. Otherwise, print the errors out. Perfect. All right. So that gets run every time. I think I'm going to leave that as. We're going to run that every time. If the password isn't set or the errors is greater than 0. Where's my errors statement? Or the count of my errors is actually greater than 0. I think that's what I did for my code, isn't it? Oh, yeah. No, I'm not there yet. Sorry. I jumped ahead. We'll come back to this. But yeah, I get excited with this one. Because not only do we validate, we also want to see, you know what, so I'm going to delete that because that's unnecessary at this point. One of the things we need to add to our code now is the writing of the new information into our database. Specifically, we need to add, we called our field, our column, email. Can validate that right here. The column is called email. So write that into that, salt colon email. Look at my email. Doesn't really matter. Okay. So now that you're going to bind that, we can also do did I call it my email? Yeah, my email. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you very, very much. I appreciate that. This is what happens when you don't copy and paste your code like I keep telling you guys to do. Thank you, both of you, for that. I appreciate that. Good eye. Actually, you're actually paying attention to what I'm doing, which is even more impressive, which is more appreciated, I should say. Oh, you threw off my game, but that I still appreciate it nevertheless. Okay, so you need to bind parameter my email to the string my email, but you need to add the my email and the my email. Yeah, and I bolded them there and I missed them. Thank you. Okay, now we want to carry the form data forward. Before you do that, you have to have a couple of placeholder variables at the very beginning of your form. Otherwise, it's going to throw a warning saying, hey, I can't populate these because the data isn't there. So what you want to do is you want to add that very early on in the process. Just set some empty strings even before you get into that code there. Might just throw them there. That seems like a good place to me. Because later on we're going to throw the default that we've determined here, we're going to add those down here inside the form. If we're going to do that and they're not actually done within here, we need to throw those errors here. All right? I think I still need an if statement here. If is set some form element. I'm pretty sure I'm going to need that here. If there is form data, process that form data. Okay. Let's try that. I think I'm going to need one more. That's better. Okay. So if there is form data, try and process that form data as much as possible. If there isn't form data, or again, if my error count is greater than 0, Error or errors? Did I call it errors? Then load the form regardless. All right. So either count is 0 and it writes to the database, or count is greater than zeros and it loads the form data. And we do that so we can auto-populate this with information. Okay, I should really be testing this after each time I modify it, but that's okay. I should really, actually, what I should be doing is checking my code. Okay, yeah, load the form, but we're going to embed the my username and the my email if that is set. And if it isn't set, it doesn't matter. It's set to an empty string way up at the beginning. So my username, and then we're just going to say value is equal to tick, and then string is equal to string my username. I think that's the syntax there. Of course, I have it right here. To my username. That looks right. And we want to do the same for email. Is there a semicolon? No, there's no semicolon. I don't need that there. Alrighty. Any questions? Okay. At this point, before you get into the required things, before you start forcing the data elements, before you get into slide 24, the last slide, I would actually encourage you to do some testing at this point to ensure that your code is working. Because I'm pretty sure it's going to throw some warnings or some errors for me. So I'm going to go ahead now and test my work. Okay, first off, it's loading without errors. Awesome. Register. Didn't throw any errors. Also good. And it's giving me my form. SJ register. Username exists. Email already exists. That's weird. How can an email not be valid and an email already exists? What the hell's going on there? Oh, you know what's going on? There's a couple of fields that don't have valid email addresses. Well, doesn't that suck? So let's set some emails. Control Enter should write it. Write the data to the database. Resend. That addresses that problem. Okay. Email is not valid. Test@test.com. Try registering. Password already exists. Email already exists. The user exists. That's worrisome. Well, let's try a password. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Register. Two passwords do not match. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Register. Email already exists. So I'm a little bit worried about that. Test 2. 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Username exists. Okay, so there's something in my code that doesn't display properly. The username does exist, so I'm going to take a look at that. But at this point, I'm pretty happy with my code. Oh. And this is what I was talking about before. I remember what's going on. This is because the information is across a couple of different fields. It creates a conflicting, confusing message. That's what's going on there. So I understand what's going on there. I'm okay with that. Because let's look at the database. The password exists here. That's the first one it finds. It complains. Once I get around that error, then it finds the username and complains about that. Alrighty? So that's what's going on with that problem. So everything seems to be working. The last thing then I want to do to my code is to add the required to the form elements. Just like that. Control C, Control V, Control V, Control V, Control S, Control R, resend, register. There it is there. Register. Perfect. Any questions? So it's not that hard to do. It's a very methodical thing that you need to do. As you can see by some of the weird errors that we've thrown, you probably want to do it like all of these other registration and login considerations at the very beginning of the development cycle. You wait too long and they add their own little confusions and their own little problems. This being the least damaging if you have to wait on something. Are there any questions? Does this make sense? Okay. So whoever started the recording, if you want to stop that now, I would appreciate it. Thank you. One thing I forgot to do in my test is to ensure that a record gets created properly in the database, which is of course part of the verification process. So I'm going to create a user that doesn't exist, call it test registration. That actually works right there. The email we're going to use is testregister@register.com. The password, we'll just use the same 1234 tab 1234. We've already tested to ensure all the error catching is working properly. Let's see if it actually successfully registers a new user. I'm going to try and log in as test. Test register, huh? That's right, test register, and the password was 1234. I can log in, but more importantly, I can see that all of the records are populated properly, including the new email address that was part of the registration process.